That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day became a story the whole community tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we show that behind struggle and silence, there are still human hearts. The river's edge was shrouded in a thin mist that clung to the ground like a reluctant memory. It was early, the kind of dawn where the sky hung heavy with grey clouds and the air carried the sharp bite of autumn chill. The water rushed past in a low, insistent murmur, swollen from overnight rains, its surface rippling with hidden currents that could pull a man under without mercy. Gravel crunched faintly underfoot along the narrow path that wound down from the old industrial park on the outskirts of town. A forgotten stretch of land where rusted chain-link fences sagged against overgrown weeds, and the distant hum of morning traffic felt like a world away. Ilara had been there since before first light, her thin jacket pulled tight around her shoulders, the fabric worn and patched from too many nights exposed to the elements. At 17, she moved like a shadow, her footsteps light and deliberate, avoiding the puddles that mirrored the dull sky above. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose knot, strands escaping to frame a face etched with quiet exhaustion. She carried no bag, just a small bundle of belongings wrapped in a faded scarf, reminders of a life she'd fled 2 years ago when the walls of her foster home had closed in like a trap. The bruises had faded, but the guilt lingered, a heavy weight in her chest that whispered she didn't deserve warmth or safety. She kept to the edges of things, invisible to the passers-by who hurried through their mornings, their eyes fixed on phones or steering wheels, never lingering on the girl who slept in alcoves and scavenged for meals. That morning, as she crouched by the water's edge to rinse a tin cup she'd found the day before, a sharp, desperate bark cut through the mist. It was frantic, echoing off the concrete pilings of the old bridge upstream, where the river bent sharply around a cluster of jagged rocks. Ilara froze, her hands trembling slightly in the cold water, droplets clinging to her fingertips like tiny accusations. She wasn't one to get involved. Survival demanded distance, a careful neutrality that kept the world's cruelties at bay. But the sound pulled at something deep inside her, a thread of memory from her own childhood. The way her little brother's cries had gone unanswered in that last house before everything shattered. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans, her breath visible in the crisp air. The barking grew louder, interspersed with splashes and a low, guttural whine that spoke of exhaustion. Peering through the fog, she spotted it, a sleek German shepherd, its black and tan coat matted and slick. Struggling against the current about 20 yards out, the dog was caught in a whirlpool near the rocks, its paws scrabbling futilely at the surface, powerful muscles straining as the water dragged it under once, twice. Its eyes, wide with panic, locked onto the shore, searching for rescue that wasn't coming. No one else was around. The path was empty, the town still stirring from sleep. Ilara's heart pounded, a steady thrum against her ribs, echoing the distant rumble of thunder rolling in from the west. She could walk away, should walk away. What did she owe a stray animal, or anyone for that matter? Her own life was a fragile thread, woven from scraps of anonymity and the hope that no one would notice her long enough to send her back. But as the dog's head dipped under again, emerging with a gasp that sprayed water into the air, she felt the old guilt twist like a knife. That boy she'd left behind, the one whose hand she'd almost reached for in the chaos. Could she ignore this now? The mist thickened, carrying the metallic tang of wet earth and the faint, acrid scent of the dog's fear sweat mingling with the river's mud. Without another thought, she kicked off her worn sneakers, the gravel biting into her bare feet as she waded in. The water was shockingly cold, seeping through her jeans up to her knees, then her thighs, numbing her skin and stealing her breath. She moved cautiously, testing each step on the slippery riverbed, her arms outstretched for balance. The current tugged at her legs, insistent and strong, whispering warnings of undertows that had claimed lives before. But she pressed on, her eyes fixed on the dog, now barely keeping its head above water, its barks reduced to weak, choking yelps. Reaching the edge of the whirlpool, Ilara extended her hand, her fingers brushing the dog's collar, a heavy leather band with metal tags that glinted dully in the pale light. "Easy," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rush of water, soft and steady despite the tremor in her limbs. The shepherd lunged toward her, its body heavy and desperate, nails scraping against her arm as it tried to climb. Pain flared, but she gritted her teeth, wrapping one arm around its neck while using the other to push against a submerged rock for leverage. The dog's weight pulled her off balance, the current swirling around her waist now, cold fingers clawing at her resolve. Her heartbeat roared in her ears, a frantic drumbeat matching the splash of waves against the rocks. Inch by inch, she hauled the animal toward shore, her muscles burning, breath coming in ragged bursts that fogged the air. The mist parted slightly, revealing the far bank where a single street lamp flickered, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. Finally, with a surge of effort that left her gasping, she dragged the dog onto the gravel, both of them collapsing in a heap. The shepherd shook itself violently, spraying water from its fur, then pressed its wet nose against her cheek, a low whine escaping its throat. Ilara sat there shivering, her hands buried in its damp coat, feeling the rapid rise and fall of its chest. For a moment, the world narrowed to this, the warmth of another living thing, the quiet rhythm of shared survival. She didn't notice the tags at first, the way they caught the light. Engraved with a unit insignia, a faded emblem of a battalion she'd never heard of. Nor did she see the distant crunch of tires on gravel, approaching from the mist-shrouded road. In that fragile peace, Ilara allowed herself a small, weary smile, unaware that her act had rippled outward, stirring echoes of loyalty in places she couldn't imagine. The river continued its murmur, indifferent, as the first hints of sunlight pierced the clouds, warming the chill just enough to promise something more than endurance. But for now, she simply held on, the dog's grateful weight a temporary anchor against the loneliness that had defined her days. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the last threads of mist, Ilara pushed herself to her feet, the gravel shifting unsteadily beneath her. The dog's coat was still dripping, forming dark pools around its paws, and it stayed close, circling her legs with a tentative loyalty that made her chest tighten. She knelt again, her fingers tracing the tags more carefully now, the metal cool and heavy against her palm. They weren't ordinary. Stamped with a serial number, a unit crest of crossed rifles and a snarling canine head, and the name Rex etched in faded letters. A military dog, she realized, her mind flashing to news clips of deployments and homecomings she'd glimpsed on public library screens. But what was it doing here, tangled in the river's grasp? The thought stirred a flicker of unease, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the immediate. The animal needed warmth, and so did she. She led Rex along the path, her bare feet numb from the cold, sneakers dangling from one hand. The industrial park unfolded around them like a graveyard of forgotten industry, crumbling warehouses with shattered windows that gaped like empty eyes, chain-link fences bowed under the weight of ivy, and the occasional rusted barrel leaking oily stains into the soil. The air smelled of damp concrete and faint diesel from a distant highway, carried on a breeze that rustled the skeletal branches of dying trees. Ilara knew this place intimately. It was her reluctant sanctuary, a maze of shadows where she could vanish during the day, foraging through dumpsters behind the few operational factories for scraps of food or discarded blankets. Society saw her as a ghost, a fleeting shape in doorways, unworthy of a second glance. Drivers sped past without slowing. Shop owners shooed her from alleys with muttered curses, and even the shelter volunteers regarded her with pitying detachment. their offers of help laced with forms and questions she couldn't answer without unraveling her fragile anonymity. 2 years ago, she'd slipped away from the foster system that had promised safety but delivered only echoes of raised voices and locked doors. The guilt gnawed at her still. The night she'd run, leaving her younger foster sibling behind in the dim hallway, their small hand reaching out as the social worker's car pulled away. She'd told herself it was for the best, that staying would only drag them both under. But the what-ifs haunted her dreams, waking her in sweats amid the alcoves of abandoned buildings. Here, in the park's periphery, she survived on the edges, rinsing clothes in public fountains, trading odd jobs like sweeping loading docks for a hot meal, always moving before dawn to avoid the patrols that swept through, labeling her a vagrant to be relocated. People whispered about kids like her. Trouble, a drain on resources, invisible until they became a problem. No one saw the quiet calculations, the way she shared her meager finds with other strays, human or otherwise, or the moral compass that kept her from stealing more than survival demanded. Rex trotted beside her, his gait steadying as the warmth returned. His ears perked toward every rustle in the underbrush. He didn't pull away when she paused to wrap her scarf around his neck like a makeshift collar, the fabric absorbing the last of the river's chill. They reached her makeshift camp behind a derelict silo, a tarp stretched between rusted beams, sheltering a pallet of flattened cardboard and a few salvaged cans arranged like sentinels. She settled him there, murmuring soft reassurances as she rummaged for a tin of water, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline's fade. The dog's eyes followed her every move, dark and trusting, a mirror to the vulnerability she buried deep. For the first time in months, the solitude felt less oppressive. His presence was a quiet bridge to something human, something worth protecting. But as midday approached, the crunch of tires grew louder, resolving into the low growl of an approaching vehicle. Ilara tensed, peering from the silo's shadow. A weathered pickup truck rumbled into view, its bed loaded with toolboxes and coiled ropes, mud splattered from off-road trails. The driver, a man in his late 40s with a salt and pepper beard and a faded baseball cap pulled low, killed the engine and stepped out, his boots thudding against the gravel. He carried himself with the deliberate poise of someone who'd faced worse than uncertainty. Broad shoulders under a worn flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms scarred from old wounds. Behind him, the air held the faint scent of gun oil and earth, remnants of a life shaped by discipline. He spotted Rex first, his face softening in a way that caught Ilara off guard, a raw flicker of relief crossing features hardened by time. "There you are, boy," he said, his voice gravelly but gentle, crouching to extend a hand. The dog bounded forward, tail wagging furiously, nuzzling into the man's palm with a joyful whine. Ilara hung back, her pulse quickening. She hadn't meant to be seen, hadn't planned on explanations. The man glanced up, his eyes, sharp blue like chips of winter sky, meeting hers without judgment. "You the one who pulled him out?" he asked, not accusatory, but with a weight that suggested he already knew. She nodded, words catching in her throat, her fingers twisting the hem of her jacket. Society painted veterans like him as relics, drifters haunted by wars they'd fought in places most folks pretended didn't exist, misunderstood as volatile or broken, their stories reduced to headlines about PTSD or unemployment lines. But up close, in the quiet of the park, he embodied something else, the steady anchor, the one who checked on neighbors during storms, volunteered at food drives without fanfare, their toughness a veil for the compassion forged in loss. His name was Marcus, he told her simply, a former sergeant in the 101st Airborne, now coordinating training for the local VFW chapter. Rex was their canine mascot, escaped during a riverside drill when a leash snapped in the wind. The battalion, scattered across the county but bound by oaths older than the town itself, had been searching since dawn, their radios crackling with urgency. As he spoke, more vehicles arrived, unhurried but purposeful. A convoy of trucks and SUVs pulling up in a loose formation, headlights cutting through the gathering dust. Men and women emerged, some in civilian clothes that couldn't hide the military bearing, the straight spines, the alert scans of the horizon. A few carried leashes and gear bags, others held thermos jugs of coffee, their conversations low murmurs laced with relief. They weren't the strangers the world imagined, storming in with aggression. They moved with quiet coordination, forming a loose circle around the site. Their presence a wall of solidarity. One woman, wiry and tattooed with unit insignias peeking from her collar, knelt beside Rex, checking him over with practiced hands, her touch as tender as a mother's. Ilara watched from the shadows, feeling exposed yet strangely seen. Marcus stood, offering her a spare blanket from his truck, the wool rough but warm. "You saved more than a dog today," he said softly, his gaze holding the echo of battles where loyalty had meant everything. The group didn't press her for details, didn't demand her story. Instead, they shared a sandwich from a cooler, the bread soft and the filling savory, a small gesture that pierced her isolation. In their midst, the air shifted, gravel crunching under boots, distant barks from other K9s echoing like calls to assembly, the wind carrying the faint metallic tang of dog tags clinking against chests. They were the overlooked guardians, judged by civilians who feared their silence as anger, their scars as threats, when truly they carried the weight of unspoken redemptions, protecting what others dismissed. As the sun dipped toward afternoon, casting long shadows across the park, Ilara felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. Rex leaned against her leg, his warmth a promise, while the battalion lingered, their quiet heroism unfolding in the ordinary light of day. The river murmured on, a constant companion, but for the first time she wasn't facing it alone. The afternoon light slanted through the skeletal frames of the warehouses, painting the gravel in hues of amber and shadow, as if the sun itself were reluctant to fully commit to the day. Ilara sat on the edge of her cardboard pallet, the blanket Marcus had given her draped over her shoulders like an unfamiliar cloak, its weight both comforting and confining. Rex lay at her feet, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, the occasional twitch of his ears betraying dreams of chases through distant dunes. The battalion had settled into a loose vigil around the camp, their presence transforming the desolate silo into something resembling a forward outpost. Thermos cups passed hand to hand, low voices weaving stories of old patrols, the faint clink of dog tags against belt buckles punctuating the air like Morse code. The wind picked up from the river, carrying the briny scent of mud and the distant rhythmic bark of another K9 echoing from the tree line. A reminder that this gathering was no accident, but a thread pulled from a larger tapestry. Marcus crouched nearby, his knees cracking softly as he adjusted a makeshift collar for Rex, his scarred fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd bandaged wounds under fire. He didn't crowd her, but his eyes, those sharp blue sentinels, flicked toward her now and then, assessing without intrusion. The others mirrored him, a cluster of veterans, men and women in their 30s to 60s, their faces weathered by sands far from this riverbank, bodies marked by the subtle efficiencies of training, long ingrained. There was Lena, the wiry woman with tattoos snaking up her arms, who knelt to distribute protein bars from a duffel, her voice a soft murmur as she spoke to Rex in the clipped tones of command turned caress. Beside her, Javier, broad-shouldered and quiet, scanned the perimeter with habitual vigilance, his hand resting near a holster that held no weapon, just the ghost of readiness. They moved with an economy born of necessity, their laughter rare but genuine, erupting like brief flares in the gathering dusk. Ilara picked at the edge of the blanket, her bare feet curling against the cooling gravel, the stone's rough texture grounding her amid the unfamiliar warmth. She'd never been part of anything like this, a circle of strangers who didn't demand her name or her past, who saw her not as a burden, but as the hand that had bridged a life from the brink. Yet beneath the tentative ease, her old instincts stirred a low hum of wariness. What did they want from her? Gratitude could curdle into obligation, and she'd learned the hard way that visibility invited chains. Her mind drifted to the foster homes, the cold linoleum floors and echoing shouts, the way she'd shrunk into corners to avoid the next bruise. Saving Rex had been impulse, a reflex against her own buried cries for help, but now, with these soldiers' eyes upon her, the guilt resurfaced, not for leaving her foster sibling, but for daring to reach out again, only to risk it all crumbling. As the sun sank lower, the wind shifted, whipping dust into small eddies that danced across the lot, carrying the metallic tang of impending rain. Conversation flowed in fragments, tales of Rex's training in the arid vastness of Fort Bragg, where the shepherd had sniffed out IEDs that saved platoons, his barks cutting through the relentless desert howl like lifelines. Marcus shared a story of a night patrol in the Hindu Kush, the squad pinned by shadows, Rex's nose leading them to safety, amid the crunch of gravel under boots and the acrid bite of cordite. They spoke of the misunderstandings back home, the sideways glances at VFW meetings, the assumptions that their silences hid rage. Their scars marked them as unstable. "Folks see the uniform and forget the man," Javier said quietly, his voice like gravel under tires, eyes fixed on the horizon. "We carry the dead with us, but that don't make us ghosts." Lena nodded, her fingers tracing the K9 emblem on her wrist, a faded ink reminder of a partner lost to a blast that still echoed in her sleep. To the world, they were relics, their loyalty dismissed as outdated, their compassion buried under layers of stoic reserve. But here, in the fading light, Elara glimpsed the truth. These were the quiet sentinels, the ones who patrolled invisible front lines in their own hometowns, checking on widows, training strays for therapy work, their toughness a shield for hearts that had learned to mend the broken. The emotional turn came unannounced, as the sky bruised to twilight and the first fat drops of rain pattered against the tarp. A child's cry pierced the murmurs, high and keening, carried on the wind from the river path below. Elara's head snapped up, her breath catching, the sound slicing through her like a blade. It was a boy, no older than 8, his small frame silhouetted against the darkening water, clothes sodden and clinging as he stumbled along the slippery bank. Behind him, the river swelled with the storm's fury, its current churning foam over the rocks where Rex had nearly perished. The child clutched a sodden backpack, his face streaked with mud and tears, but it was the desperation in his steps that froze the group. A runaway, perhaps, or one of the overlooked urchins who haunted the park's edges, now teetering too close to the edge as a sudden swell tugged at his ankles. Everyone stilled, the veteran's postures shifting instinctively, hands hovering near pockets, eyes narrowing in assessment. Lena whispered a curse under her breath. Javier's jaw tightened, and Marcus rose slowly, his voice a low command, into a radio clipped to his belt. Perimeter check, possible civilian in distress. But the rain intensified, drumming on the metal silo like urgent fingers, blurring the path and swelling the river's roar to a thunderous growl. The boy slipped, his cry sharpening to panic as he clawed at the mud, the water lapping hungrily at his waist. Elara's heart hammered, a frantic echo of her own flight years ago, the night she'd run into similar shadows, leaving a smaller hand grasping air. The guilt surged, hot and unrelenting, mingling with the adrenaline that flooded her veins, her hands trembling as she pushed to her feet. No one moved yet. Protocol demanded caution, evaluation of threats in the storm's chaos, but she couldn't wait. The boy's wide eyes locked on the shore, pleading in a language of pure fear, mirroring the dog's earlier desperation. Without a word, Ilara bolted from the shelter, the rain soaking her instantly, cold needles pricking her skin as she scrambled down the embankment. Gravel gave way to slick clay underfoot, her bare feet sliding, heart pounding in sync with the downpour's relentless beat. The battalion stirred behind her, boots crunching in pursuit, voices calling her name for the first time, laced with concern rather than command. Marcus was first, his longer strides closing the gap, but she was already at the water's edge, extending her arm toward the boy as the current pulled him deeper. "Grab on!" she shouted, her voice raw against the storm, fingers outstretched like a lifeline. The child lunged, his small hand clasping hers with surprising strength, nails digging into her palm as she braced against a root protruding from the bank. The river fought back, its icy grip yanking at them both, but she held firm, muscles screaming from the earlier rescue, breath ragged in the whipping wind. In that suspended moment, as thunder rumbled overhead and the rain blurred her vision, Ilara felt the weight of her past converge, the sibling she'd failed, the isolation she'd armored herself with, now channeled into this desperate pull. The boy scrambled up, collapsing against her, his sobs muffled against her shoulder, the warmth of his trembling body a stark contrast to the chill seeping into her bones. Marcus reached them then, his strong arms hauling them both to safety, the battalion forming a human chain up the slope, hands linking in unbreakable solidarity. Lena wrapped the child in a spare jacket, Javier scanning for more strays in the gloom, their movements a symphony of practiced grace amid the chaos. As they crested the path, the full weight of the night settled. The battalion's trucks idling in the distance, headlights piercing the veil like beacons, dozens more arriving in a convoy that stretched along the access road, gravel crunching under tires as soldiers disembarked. Forming ranks that lined the perimeter, Ilara knelt in the mud, the boy clinging to her, his whispers of thanks lost in the rain. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady, eyes reflecting a deeper recognition. The way she fought for the vulnerable echoed a young recruit they'd lost overseas, a kid with the same quiet fire, pulled under by currents. No one saw coming. "You remind us of him," he said softly, over the patter of drops, his voice thick with unspoken loss. The revelation hung there, redefining the rescue not as chance, but as a mirror to their own redemptions, the dog's salvation now intertwined with this child's. In the circle of their protection, Ilara felt the first crack in her armor, the possibility of belonging flickering like the distant taillights. "Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel." The rain hammered down in relentless sheets, turning the embankment into a treacherous slide of mud and uprooted grass, each step a battle against the earth's slick betrayal. Ilara's lungs burned as she half-carried, half-dragged the boy up the slope, his small body slick and shivering against hers, the weight of him anchoring her even as the storm clawed at their progress. The river's roar swelled behind them, a furious beast awakened by the downpour, its waves crashing against the rocks with the force of distant artillery, sending sprays of foam that stung like shrapnel. Thunder cracked overhead, vibrating through her chest, mingling with the frantic thud of her heartbeat, a rhythm that drowned out the battalion's calls, their voices blending into the wind's howl like echoes from another life. She didn't look back at first, her focus narrowed to the boy's whimpers, soft and broken against her neck, his fingers knotted in the sodden fabric of her jacket. Fear coiled in her gut, not just for him, but for the fragility of this moment. One wrong slide and the current would claim them both, erasing her fragile act of defiance in a swirl of dark water. Adrenaline surged through her veins, sharpening her senses, the metallic tang of rain on stone, the gritty slide of mud under her bare soles, the boy's rapid breaths hot against her skin. Guilt twisted deeper, a familiar spectre. This child, with his wide, trusting eyes, was a mirror to the siblings she'd abandoned in the shadows of that foster hallway, their cries unanswered as she fled into the night. Determination hardened her jaw, pushing her forward. She wouldn't fail again, not when the river's hunger gnawed so close. Marcus was a shadow at her side, his arm steadying her elbow. His boots finding purchase where hers slipped, the gravel crunching like brittle bones under his weight. Behind them, the squad moved in formation. Lena and Javier flanking the rear, their hands extended like a living tether, pulling the group upward through the deluge. The air thickened with the scent of wet earth and pine from the tree line, undercut by the faint, oily whiff of truck exhaust as more vehicles rumbled into position at the top. But the tension escalated as a sharp cry cut through the storm. Not the boys, but a new voice, distant yet piercing from the river's bend. Another figure, a woman this time, her silhouette blurred by the rain, teetering on the flooded path downstream, her arms waving frantically as the water rose to her knees. She was calling for the boy, her words lost to the gale, but the desperation was unmistakable, a mother, perhaps, or guardian, caught in the same perilous drift. Ilara's steps faltered, her breath hitching as the scene unfolded. The woman slipped, her body pitching forward into the churning flow, the river seizing her with greedy arms. The battalion reacted instantly, their training snapping into place like a well-oiled mechanism. Marcus barked coordinates into his radio, the static crackle sharp against the thunder, while Javier veered left, uncoiling a rope from his pack with fluid precision. But the distance was too great, the current too swift. The woman's head bobbed once, twice, before vanishing under a wave, her cry swallowed by the foam. Panic clawed at Ilara's throat, a raw surge that blurred her vision, her hands tightening around the boy as if to shield him from the unfolding horror. This wasn't just rescue, it was confrontation with the world's indifference, the moral danger of inaction that had scarred her own soul. She couldn't leave another soul to the depths, not after Rex, not after this child. "Go back!" Marcus urged, his voice steady but edged with urgency, his hand gripping her shoulder to halt her descent. The squad formed a hasty line, bodies braced against the wind, but Ilara shook him off, the boy's weight now shared as Lena took him higher. Adrenaline overrode reason. She plunged forward alone, sliding down a parallel gully, the mud sucking at her legs like quicksand. Cold rivulets tracing icy paths down her spine. Fear thrummed in her ears, louder than the barking of distant K9s mobilized from the trucks, their handlers' shouts coordinating the perimeter. The river loomed, its surface a roiling chaos of debris, branches snapping like gunfire, the water's chill radiating up like a grave's breath. She scanned the foam, heart pounding with the terror of failure, guilt flashing visions of her past. The foster home's locked doors, the sibling's face fading in the rearview mirror. There, a flash of fabric, the woman's dark hair surfacing amid the rocks, her arms flailing weakly against the pull. Ilara waded in without hesitation, the current slamming into her like a wall, numbing her thighs and stealing her balance. The water was deeper here, up to her chest, its force dragging her sideways, testing her resolve with every gasp. She lunged, fingers grazing the woman's sleeve, the fabric slippery and torn, pulling her under for a heartbeat before resurfacing with a desperate inhale. "Hold on!" Ilara gasped, her voice hoarse, wrapping an arm around the woman's waist as the river fought back, waves crashing over them in salty bursts. The woman's eyes met hers, wild with terror, then flickering with fragile hope, her body limp from exhaustion, the weight threatening to drag them both down. Ilara's muscles screamed, determination fueling her as she kicked toward a protruding boulder, her free hand scrabbling for purchase, nails splitting against the slick stone. From the bank, the battalion mobilized in full. Trucks' engines revving like war drums, headlights slicing through the rain to illuminate the struggle, casting elongated shadows that danced across the water. Soldiers disembarked in waves, forming a human wall along the edge, their silhouettes etched against the storm's fury, broad shoulders linked arm to arm, ropes uncoiling like lifelines. K9 units barking in urgent harmony, their paws scrabbling at the gravel. Marcus led the effort, directing operators with clipped commands, the radio static a constant underscore to the chaos. One by one, they extended the chain, hands clasping in unyielding solidarity, pulling Ilara and the woman inch by inch from the abyss. The air filled with the crunch of boots on wet stone, the low rumble of encouragement passing down the line, dog tags glinting under flashlights like talismans of shared trials. As they hauled the woman onto solid ground, collapsing in a heap amid the mud, Ilara's vision swam, her body trembling from the cold and the toll. The woman coughed, water spilling from her lips, her arms clutching Ilara in a wordless embrace. The boy rushing to her side with a sob that cut through the subsiding rain. But in that breathless pause, as the battalion encircled them, dozens strong now, their faces illuminated by portable lanterns, eyes reflecting a profound, unspoken bond, Marcus knelt beside her, his expression cracking with the weight of memory. He pulled a chain from beneath his collar, a dog tag worn smooth by years, engraved with the battalion's crest and the name of that lost recruit. Elias, a young soldier with Ilara's same quiet fire, drowned in a flash flood overseas, his hand slipping from reach in the desert's deceptive wadi. "You pulled her out, like he would have," Marcus murmured, his voice thick, the tag dangling like an offering in the lantern's glow. The revelation rippled through the group, whispers of Elias's story, the moral wound they'd carried, how Ilara's courage echoed his, turning her act from isolated heroism to a bridge across their shared losses. The woman, it turned out, was the boy's aunt, a single parent overwhelmed by eviction and despair, mirroring the vulnerabilities the battalion guarded in silence. In their eyes, Ilara wasn't a homeless girl anymore. She was kin, her determination a redemption for them all. The storm eased to a drizzle, the river's roar fading to a murmur as the human wall held firm, gravel crunching softly under shifting feet, the distant bark of K9s a lullaby of protection. For the first time, Ilara's guilt eased, replaced by the warmth of hands extended, not in judgment, but in quiet acceptance. The drizzle persisted like a whispered regret, softening the edges of the world into a haze of grey, where the river's murmur blended with the low hum of idling engines along the access road. Ilara sat huddled under the overhang of a truck's tailgate, the metal still warm from the drive, its faint scent of heated rubber and exhaust mingling with the earthy petrichor rising from the soaked ground. The aunt, her name was Clara, revealed in shaky breaths between coughs, clutched her nephew close, the boy's face buried in her damp sweater, their shared shivers a quiet symphony against the patter of rain on canvas tarps. The battalion had expanded into a full encampment now, trucks forming a protective semicircle, their headlights dimmed to avoid drawing unwanted eyes from the distant highway. Soldiers moved with purposeful grace, distributing dry blankets and hot mugs of coffee that steamed in the chill air, the aroma of bitter brew cutting through the dampness like a promise of solace. Ilara's hands trembled as she accepted a mug, the ceramic hot against her palms, sending tendrils of warmth up her arms that battled the numbness settling in her bones. Marcus lingered nearby, the dog tag still dangling from his fingers, its chain swaying gently in the breeze that carried faint barks from the K9 handlers securing the perimeter. The revelation about Elias hung between them, heavy as the storm clouds lingering overhead, stirring a deeper current in her chest, a mix of empathy and dread. She'd glimpsed it in their eyes, the way her plunge into the river echoed that lost recruit's final moments, not in defeat, but in unyielding reach for another life. Guilt, her old companion, twisted anew. Saving Clara and the boy hadn't erased her past failures, but it illuminated them, casting shadows that made her feel exposed, raw under the lantern's soft glow. The gravel crunched softly under shifting boots, a constant underscore to the veterans' low conversations, their voices laced with the gravelly timbre of shared hardships, punctuated by the jingle of tags against chests. As the rain eased to a fine mist, tension rippled through the group like a distant thunder roll. A radio crackled to life from Javier's belt, static slicing the air before a sergeant's voice emerged, clipped and urgent. Inbound activity, possible patrols sweeping the park, evac protocols. Heads turned, postures straightening with instinctive precision, the air thickening with the scent of alertness, sweat-dampened wool, and the metallic tang of gear being checked. The industrial ruins, once a sanctuary of anonymity, now felt like a tightening noose. Ilara knew the local authorities' routines all too well, their sweeps for vagrants that uprooted lives without mercy, bundling the overlooked into vans bound for shelters or worse. Clara tensed, her arm tightening around the boy, whispering assurances that rang hollow against the encroaching uncertainty. For Ilara, the fear was visceral, a cold knot in her stomach, adrenaline flickering back to life, her mind racing to the foster system's grasp, the forms and questions that would unravel her fragile freedom. Marcus knelt beside her, his presence a steady anchor amid the stir, the dog tag now resting in his open palm like an unspoken invitation. "We don't leave our own behind," he said quietly, his blue eyes holding hers, reflecting the lantern light in pinpricks of resolve. The battalion mobilized without fanfare, Lena coordinating the canine units, their leashes taut as the dogs paced, ears pricked to the wind, carrying faint sirens from town. Javier directed the convoy's repositioning, trucks rumbling into tighter formation, gravel protesting under tires as they created a buffer wall, headlights sweeping the tree line like searchlights in a night-op. Dozens more arrived in the gloom, a steady influx from the county's outposts, weathered Humvees and pickups disgorging soldiers who fanned out, forming ranks that lined the paths and riverbank, their silhouettes blending into the mist-shrouded warehouses. The human wall grew, arm to arm, a living barrier etched against the fading twilight, dog tags glinting faintly, barks echoing in disciplined harmony as if summoning echoes from forgotten battlefields. Ilara's breath quickened, the moral danger sharpening into focus, the risk of exposure, of being seen not as savior but as intruder in this circle of loyalty. Clara reached for her hand, fingers cold and grateful, murmuring thanks that pierced the din, but the aunt's eyes held a deeper plea, protection for her nephew, a child teetering on the edge of the system's indifferent maw, much like Ilara once had. The boy's wide gaze met hers, innocent and trusting, triggering a cascade of memories, the foster hallway's dim light, the small hand slipping from her grasp as she ran. Determination surged, hot against the chill, pushing her to stand despite the ache in her limbs, water still dripping from her hair in rivulets that traced icy paths down her neck. She wouldn't flee this time. The battalion's quiet heroism, their compassion veiled in tactical efficiency, mirrored the core of goodness she'd buried under layers of survival. Fear clawed at her edges, but so did the pull of redemption, the chance to stand firm where she'd once faltered. The patrol's lights pierced the distance first, flashing blues and reds weaving through the industrial maze, sirens a low wail that set the dogs to low growls, their paws scraping gravel in agitation. The battalion held position unyielding, Marcus stepping forward to intercept, his voice calm over the radio as he invoked protocols for civilian aid in distress. Tension coiled like a spring, the air electric with the scent of wet asphalt and impending confrontation, hearts pounding in unison beneath uniforms worn thin by time. Ilara pressed closer to Clara and the boy, her hand finding Rex's collar, the dog's steady warmth a talisman against the unknown. Minutes stretched into eternity. The wall of soldiers a fortress of flesh and resolve, their breaths visible in the cooling night, tags clinking softly like prayers. As the patrol crested the rise, hesitation flickered in their approach. The sight of the organized ranks, the K9s at alert, giving pause to what might have been a routine sweep. Negotiations unfolded in murmurs, Marcus's gravelly assurances weaving through the static, emphasizing the rescues, the lives pulled from the river's jaws. The tension peaked, a breathless standoff under the stars emerging through thinning clouds, then ebbed as the patrol relented, lights dimming as they retreated, leaving the night to the battalion's vigil. Relief washed over the group like the subsiding rain, sighs mingling with the crunch of settling gravel, barks softening to contented whuffs. In the quiet aftermath, Marcus turned to Ilara, the dog tag extended fully now, its chain pooling in his hand. "Elias wore this," he said, voice thick with the weight of years, "until the end. It saved him once, caught on a branch in that wadi. Now it's yours, a battalion coin of sorts, forged in the same fire." The revelation deepened, tying her courage to their losses, redefining her isolation as shared lineage. She hesitated, fingers brushing the metal, cool and etched with the K9 emblem, a snarling shepherd amid crossed rifles, feeling the emblem's promise, protection, belonging, a family forged not by blood, but by acts that defied the dark. The wall of soldiers parted slightly, hands clapping her shoulders in silent welcome, their eyes reflecting the quiet heroism that bound them. Rex nuzzled her side, tail thumping against the ground as the convoy's engines hummed softly, ready to carry them all to safety. For Ilara, the guilt receded further, replaced by a tentative light, the warmth of community, unexpected and profound. In the heart of the overlooked, the river whispered on, a distant lullaby, as the night wrapped them in its somber embrace. The night deepened into a velvet shroud, the mist from the river weaving through the encampment like threads of forgotten dreams, carrying the faint briny whisper of water over stones. Lanterns cast pools of amber light on the gravel, where shadows pooled in the crevices like unspoken regrets, and the air held the crisp edge of cooling earth, mingled with the warm, musky scent of damp fur from the K9s settling at their handlers' feet. Ilara sat cross-legged on a folded tarp, the battalion coin, Marcus's dog tag, resting heavy in her palm, its edges worn smooth by years of quiet carriage, the K9 emblem catching the flicker of flame from a nearby portable stove. Rex pressed against her side, his breath steady and warm, a low rumble in his chest vibrating through her like a heartbeat shared. The convoy's trucks idled in a protective arc, their engines a soft rhythmic purr that underscored the group's hushed vigil. Headlights dimmed to slits that pierced the gloom without inviting scrutiny. Clara and the boy, his name was Theo, whispered in the aftermath, huddled under a shared blanket nearby, the aunt's hand stroking his hair in slow, reassuring arcs, her face etched with the exhaustion of one who had stared into the abyss and been pulled back. The battalion encircled them all, a living fortress of weathered faces and calloused hands, their postures relaxed yet alert, dog tags glinting faintly against collars as they passed around tin mugs of reheated stew, the savory steam rising in curls that warmed the chill seeping from the ground. Javier leaned against a truck fender, his broad frame silhouetted against the starry veil emerging overhead. While Lena murmured to a young handler about Theo's needs, clean clothes, a check for hypothermia, their voices a gentle cadence amid the night's hush. No one pressed Ilara for her story. Instead, they wove her into theirs with subtle gestures, a nod from a silver-haired sergeant who'd lost a leg in the sands of Fallujah, the offer of a spare pair of socks from a woman whose eyes held the quiet fire of desert patrols. But as the stars wheeled slowly above, the late revelation unfolded like a wound, reopening under careful hands. Marcus settled beside her on the tarp, his knees creaking softly, the gravel shifting beneath him with a faint crunch that echoed the crunch of arid trails he'd once trod. He stared into the lantern's flame, its dance reflecting in his eyes like distant campfires, before speaking in a voice low and measured, threaded with the gravel of unspoken grief. "Elias wasn't just a recruit," he began, the words emerging slow, each one weighted with the dust of memory. "He was the kid who pulled strays from wadis during downtime, the one who'd dive into flash floods for a lost pack animal, never thinking twice. Lost him in a swell, much like this river. Sand turned to mud overnight, currents that hid their strength until it was too late. We searched for hours, the wind howling like banshees, dog tags clinking against our vests as we formed chains just like tonight. But he slipped away, reaching for a handler who'd fallen ahead." Ilara's fingers tightened around the coin, the metal warming to her touch, her breath catching as the parallels sharpened into focus. Theo's soft snores from Clara's lap, Rex's trusting lean. These weren't coincidences, but echoes, her impulsive plunge mirroring Elias's moral compass, the one that had bound the battalion in loyalty forged from loss. The revelation redefined everything. Her act hadn't just saved lives, it had resurrected a fragment of their shared wound, turning isolation into interconnection. Marcus's gaze met hers, steady and profound, the lines around his eyes deepening with a compassion that pierced her defenses. "You reached where we couldn't," he said simply, his hand covering hers briefly. Calluses rough against her skin, conveying the quiet heroism that defined them, not in grand gestures, but in the steady pull against the dark. The group stirred subtly, heads nodding in silent affirmation, their faces illuminated by the stove's glow, revealing micro-reactions. A jaw unclenching, eyes softening with the relief of partial mending, the air thick with the scent of stew and the faint, metallic tang of tags shifting on chains. In that circle, the symbol of acceptance solidified, no longer just a token, but a bridge. Marcus unclasped the chain fully, draping it around her neck, the dog tag settling against her collarbone with a cool finality, its weight a promise etched in metal. The battalion's emblem of belonging, a K9 snarling amid rifles, symbolizing the pack that guarded its own. "Wear it when you're ready," he murmured, "or carry it close. It's yours now, like Rex." Ilara's throat tightened, tears pricking unbidden as she traced the engraving, the act stirring a tremor in her hands, her heartbeat syncing with the distant bark of a K9 patrolling the perimeter. The human wall reformed loosely around them, soldiers' boots scraping gravel in a subtle salute, their presence a tapestry of compassion behind the toughness. Veterans who patrolled hometowns as fiercely as foreign fronts, offering redemption through the community they'd built from scars. Clara reached over, squeezing Ilara's arm, her touch conveying gratitude that needed no words, while Theo stirred, offering a sleepy smile that cracked the last shell of her guilt. As the night wore on, the convoy prepared to move, engines rumbling to life with a low growl that scattered the mist, headlights sweeping the path ahead like guiding stars. Ilara rose, the tag a steady presence against her chest, Rex at her heel as she helped Clara and Theo into a truck's cab, the door closing with a soft thud that sealed a new beginning. The battalion dispersed in orderly waves, trucks crunching over gravel towards safe houses and outposts, their tail lights fading into the dark, like fireflies retreating to dawn. Ilara climbed into the lead vehicle beside Marcus, the interior warm with the scent of worn leather and coffee, the road unfolding under tires that whispered of journeys yet to come. For the first time, the loneliness ebbed, replaced by the quiet rhythm of shared breath, the moral conflicts of her past yielding to the humanity she'd uncovered in these unexpected guardians. In the reflective hush of the drive, the river receded behind them, its murmurs giving way to the wind's soft sigh through cracked windows, carrying hints of pine and distant rain. Ilara gazed out at the passing shadows of warehouses, their silhouettes softening in the pre-dawn light, feeling the weight of redemption settle like dew on grass. Somber, poetic, a slow unveiling of hearts that beat against the silence. The battalion's intervention that night wasn't conquest, but embrace. A community rising from misunderstanding to forge bonds unbreakable as dog tags. And in that belonging, her overlooked world expanded. A vulnerable girl no longer adrift, but anchored in quiet heroism. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Ilara reach more people who still believe in humanity. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of homeless girl saved a canine from drowning. The veteran's entire battalion arrived that night. See you in the next one.